Welcome to the In the Game Room podcast, presented by GC Mini. Today we're ditching the trenches and grabbing our bayonets as we dive deep into close quarters combat in Bolt Action version 3.
Oh yeah, getting up close and personal. This is where the fun begins.
You know, it's funny, even in this era of tanks and long-range artillery, some battles just come down to boots on the ground fighting tooth and nail for every inch. Why do you think close combat has such a timeless appeal, even in a game set during large-scale 20th century wars?
Well, for me, it's about those moments where strategy gives way to just sheer guts and determination. It's the ultimate test of nerve, right?
Okay.
Where every roll of the dice could mean losing a whole squad or, claiming a hard-fought victory. And Bolt Action version 3, it really captures that tension with the updated close combat rules.
Absolutely. So let's set the scene a little bit. I'm pinned down by a German machine gun nest. We need to take them out and fast.
Yeah.
So how do I launch an assault in Bolt Action version 3?
First things first, you got to declare your assault. It's just like declaring a shooting action. You pick your target. But, and this is important, you can only choose one enemy unit to target.
Oh, really? So no more flanking maneuvers or multi-pronged attacks? That's a big change.
Yeah, it really makes you prioritize your targets and, think tactically. Now, once you've declared it's time for the good stuff, the charge, of course you're going to want to issue a run order to your unit. Get those boots on the ground and close that distance. But Bolt Action version 3, well, they make it interesting. They've thrown in some curveballs this time around.
Curveballs. Okay, now you got to tell me more. What kind of curveballs?
Just picture this. You're sprinting across no man's land. The ground's all torn up, barbed wire everywhere. Maybe there's even a bombed-out building in your way. Version 3 simulates this by limiting your run move to just 6 inches if you're starting in, or even just moving through rough ground or obstacles.
So no more heroic charges from one side of the board to the other.
Not unless you want your troops getting bogged down or worse, cut down before they even reach the enemy. Adds an element of realism, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. So, okay, I'm charging across this chaotic battlefield. What's the enemy doing while all this is happening? I mean, I can't imagine they're just going to sit there politely waiting for me to get close enough for a bayonet tickle.
You'd think so, right? But here's where V3 gets really interesting. Their reaction, not always as predictable as you might think. See if they haven't acted yet that turn, they do get a chance to shoot back. But, big but, if you can make it within 6 inches before they can react, they're caught flat-footed. Too close for effective return fire.
So it's a gamble then.
Yeah.
Charge from a distance and risk getting cut down, or get up close and personal and hope for the best.
Exactly. It adds a layer of strategy to every assault. Of course, there are always exceptions. Ambushes, for example. If you run into a hidden enemy unit, well, those 6-inch rules, yeah, they don't apply there.
Ambushes always keep things interesting. It's like they say, expect the unexpected. But what about fixed weapons, like machine gun nests or artillery? How do they factor into close combat?
Good question. So fixed weapons, they can only react to your charge if you're within their arc fire at the start of your move.
So positioning is key. Gotta outmaneuver those fixed emplacements.
You got it. Just
Yeah.
like a real battlefield commander, you've got to use the terrain and your unit's strengths to your advantage. But let's say you do survive the initial charge and reach your target. Things are about to get really intense.
All right, let's talk about that moment of impact. 2 units collide, what happens?
It's a brawl. You're right up in their faces, base-to-base contact. Every model touching an enemy model is engaged. Pure chaos.
Okay, so what about those poor soldiers who are stuck in the back, unable to reach an enemy model because their buddies are in the way? Are they just left out of the fight?
Not at all. Even those models are still considered part of the fight. They'll be positioned as close as possible, maybe even touching their own unit members who are engaged, and they still get to roll dice and contribute.
That makes sense. I like that. So it really emphasizes that idea that in close combat, every soldier counts.
Yeah.
Now, we can't forget about the terrain itself, can we? Trenches, hedgerows, those iconic World War II battlefields, those have got to play a role in all of this.
For sure, terrain can be your best friend or your worst enemy in close combat. Version 3 gives you some really cool ways to use those elements. Let's say you've got an enemy unit behind a stone wall. It's tempting to just charge right over,
All right. Show 'em who's boss.
Easier said than done. You see, while you can assault at full run distance, if the obstacle is the only thing between you and them, you'll be engaging them around the obstacle, not directly over it. And get this, the defenders get a bonus in the fight.
So you could end up charging into a meat grinder.
Could happen. It's a risk-reward scenario, that's for sure. But those tactical decisions are what make close combat in Bolt Action version 3 so much fun.
Speaking of fun, let's break down the melee round itself.
Yeah.
What are the actual mechanics involved once those units are locked in hand-to-hand combat?
Get ready for a whirlwind of action. In Bolt Action V3, both the attackers and defenders roll to damage at the same time. And here's a big difference from shooting. There are no cover saves in close combat.
Oh, wow. So it's all about hitting hard and hitting fast.
You got it. It's a pure test of brute strength and a little luck. Now, to make things clear, all models, even the ones that get taken out as casualties, they all fight and roll for damage first. Then once both sides have rolled, that's when casualties are removed.
Okay, so figure out all the attacks and then see who's left standing. Makes sense.
Exactly. Now, the side that inflicts the most casualties, they win the round. Simple as that. And if one side is completely wiped out during the fight, well, even if they inflicted some losses themselves, the other side automatically wins.
It's all about survival. Now, we talked about the advantage of defending behind those obstacles earlier. Does that come into play at all during the melee itself?
It does. Remember how defenders get that bonus when you charge over obstacles or rough ground? Well, they also get to strike first in the melee.
So those small tactical decisions, like where to position a unit even by an inch or two, can really have a big impact. But what happens if both sides fight valiantly, but neither manages to completely wipe out the other?
Ah, you're talking about a classic stalemate.
Do we just agree to disagree and move on to the next objective?
Not in Bolt Action. Nope, there are no ties in close combat. If both sides are still kicking after a round of melee, they fight another round, and another if they have to, until one side breaks.
Wow, talk about a battle of attrition. Those close quarters engagements can be brutal. Okay, so let's say one side is victorious. What happens to those triumphant warriors? And what about the poor souls who, weren't so lucky?
Victory has its perks. The winners get a free move to regroup, consolidate their position.
A well-deserved breather after all that. But there have to be some limitations. I don't know, they can't just wander off the battlefield.
Of course not. This isn't a victory lap. You can't use it to leave the field entirely or mount transports or anything like that. It's about getting back into formation, not celebrating just yet. As for the losers, well, any survivors are assumed captured, maybe they're fleeing or playing dead. Either way, they're removed from play. Casualties of war,
Such is the nature of war,
Yeah.
especially in those desperate close quarters encounters. So we've covered attacking infantry, but what about those artillery crews? How does close combat work against them?
Those artillery crews, they're often caught out in the open when the enemy comes charging in. Must feel like sitting ducks.
Yeah, they're vulnerable, but I'm assuming they're not completely defenseless.
You're right about that. The rules for engaging them in close combat, basically the same as infantry. They fight back, roll to damage, and see what happens.
So even if you're manning a massive artillery piece, you better know how to use that sidearm or entrenching tool. Speaking of tools, we've got to talk about obstacles and terrain some more. I mean, assaulting a unit that's dug in behind a stone wall has got to be way different from charging across an open field.
You're spot on, Ruby. Terrain is huge in close quarters, and Bolt Action V3 does a great job of simulating that. So, picture this. You're facing an enemy unit holed up behind a stone wall. There might be some crumbling sections, bullet holes, just enough cover to make things interesting.
Okay, I can see it. Classic stone wall scenario. How did that change a close quarters assault?
Well, first off, it's risky. Remember, those defenders get a defensive bonus and they get to strike first in the melee. And depending on how the wall is set up, you might not even be able to see all the enemy models you're engaging with.
So you'd be walking into a trap.
Could happen. And fields of fire become even more important. The defenders are going to try to funnel you into those kill zones. A straight-on assault against a well-defended wall, usually a recipe for disaster.
Okay, so what about hedgerows? They seem like a different beast altogether.
Hedgerows are tricky. You've got that dense vegetation, perfect for concealment. It's claustrophobic fighting, real nail-biter stuff. In Bolt Action, they act as both obstacles and cover, so they can really slow your movement down, funnel you into these narrow paths. They can be used to your advantage or be a total death trap depending on how you play it.
So many factors to consider. Terrain, enemy positions, potential hidden threats.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
That's why we're doing a deep dive.
Right.
Got to talk about all this good stuff.
Right. So we've talked a lot about being on the attack. But what about when you're on the defense? Buildings must be super important in close combat.
Absolutely. A building can be a death trap or a lifesaver. It really adds a whole other level of complexity.
Oh, I bet. Walls, doors, windows, multiple floors.
Yeah.
It's a whole different game from fighting out in the open.
Yep. Buildings break up the battlefield, create choke points, offer cover. And visibility is huge. Windows become sniper nests. Hallways become kill zones.
And don't forget about staircases.
Right. Controlling the high ground is always key. It's like those classic house-to-house battles you see in war movies. Every room could be hiding an enemy unit, and Bolt Action V3 does a great job of recreating that chaos. You can have room-to-room fighting, use furniture for cover, and even the building itself can take damage and collapse.
Hold on, we're talking about the building itself being damaged.
Oh, yeah. They're not just set pieces. Buildings in Bolt Action are part of the fight. They can be damaged, they can collapse, they can even catch fire.
Wow, that's amazing. So you could have a situation where a well-placed grenade or a lucky artillery strike could turn the tide of the battle by literally bringing the house down.
Exactly. And don't forget about the psychological impact of all that. Imagine the fear of being trapped under rubble or burned alive. It can be devastating to a unit's morale.
Speaking of morale, how do you think being stuck inside a building during close-quarter combat affects a unit's, their will to fight?
Now that's where things get really interesting. Close combat is already a test of nerve, right? But fighting inside a building, where the enemy could be anywhere, it's terrifying.
Yeah, it's like sensory overload.
Right. And Bolt Action V3 simulates that tension really well. It's about more than just rolling dice, You've got to factor in the psychological impact of those close quarters engagements. It's what makes the game so immersive, I think.
For sure. So we've talked about the attacks, the terrain, even the buildings themselves, but we haven't really touched on the mental game, have we? How does Bolt Action version 3 reflect the psychological pressure of fighting like this? It's about more than just the physical fight, isn't it? It's that mental pressure that can make or break you.
Absolutely. And that's something Bolt Action V3 really nails, I think. Remember those pin markers we talked about?
Yeah.
The ones that represent units pinned down by enemy fire? Yeah, those don't apply in close combat.
Oh, wow. So no more cautiously peeking over a hedgerow, hoping you don't get a face full of lead.
Nope. Once those bayonets are fixed, it's all about nerve. Either your troops are committed or they break. It's as much about willpower as it is about firepower at that point.
It's about looking your enemy in the eye and fighting for your life. No room for second guessing.
Exactly. And Bolt Action V3 captures that so well.
So we've covered a lot today. The tactics, the terrain, the psychological impact. It's a lot to process. What are some key things our listeners should remember about close combat as they're planning their next game?
Well, for me, the biggest thing is that it's all about calculated risks. It can win you the game, but it can also cost you dearly.
So don't go charging in blindly.
Exactly. Think it through, look at the terrain, pick your targets carefully. A well-timed assault can turn the tide, but a reckless one. That's how you lose a squad.
And what about those heroic charges we talked about earlier? Those long, daring runs across the battlefield.
Sometimes they work out, sometimes they don't. With the new movement rules in version 3, you've really got to pick your moments.
It's about strategy and a little bit of luck.
Oh.
And, of course, we can't forget about the mental aspect of it all.
Right. Willpower versus firepower. It's a fascinating dynamic.
So we've covered a ton of ground here. From how to launch an assault to what to consider when you're hunkering down in a building. If you had to pick just a few key takeaways for our listeners, what would those be?
Don't charge in blindly. I know we've said it a bunch, but seriously, close combat is risky. It can win you the game, but you got to be smart about it. Pick your moments, assess the situation.
It's like poker. You've got to know when to hold them and when to fold them.
Exactly. And terrain is your friend. Use it to your advantage, whether you're attacking or defending. A well-placed wall or hedgerow can make all the difference.
And don't forget about those buildings. They could be death traps or fortresses, depending on how you use them.
Right. So many factors to consider. But that's what makes Bolt Action version 3 so much fun to play. It's more than just pushing miniatures around a table. It's about those tactical decisions, those moments of bravery, and those desperate last stands.
It's about bringing history to life.
Exactly. And close combat. Well, that's where it all comes to a head.
Well said. It's been a blast chatting about close combat with you. Where can our listeners go to pick up the latest Bolt Action stuff? Get those miniatures painted up and ready for battle.
Head on over to GC Mini. They've got everything you need.
Awesome. And be sure to check back for more Bolt Action V3 episodes. We'll be diving deep into all sorts of exciting topics. Until next time, keep those dice rolling.
And those bayonets sharp.